Today we are talking to Jeremy Dicker. He is one of the funniest people in geopolitics, which admittedly I realize is a category with very little competition, but he spent 14 years as an Australian diplomat stationed in Mexico City, Lima, and Los Angeles. Peru gave him a presidential medal, and then he did something most diplomats never do. He left the cable traffic behind, started a meme account, and built a media company called International Intrigue that has since gone viral for its coverage of geopolitics. Today, Jeremy joins us to talk about why geopolitics doesn't have to be boring and what the world looks like when you stop writing for prime ministers and start writing for CEOs and the global public. This is Kit Conklin. Welcome to the Extra Exchange. All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. I have to start here. 14 years as an Australian Foreign Service diplomat. You've got cocktail parties, you've got tuxedos, you've got all of this awesome stuff. You're getting medals from heads of state. And then you woke up one morning and you said, you know what would be a good idea? I want to start a media company. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate summary of some of the wild life choices I've made. I have no regrets. Serving my country as a diplomat, it was an absolute dream job for any kid from the suburbs. In my case, the suburbs of Sydney. I thought they'd have to pull me out of there in a chair. I just thought I was going to be there right until the days of my retirement, But sometimes life throws you curveballs. And, I had two friends who had this idea to start a media company. I mean, just a wild idea. There are, billionaire media barons flailing in the current media environment of, polarization and AI and all kinds of challenges. But we, with zero media experience, thought that maybe we could do it. So far, so good. I mean, we've been going, International Intrigue's been going 3 or 4 years now. So I don't know. It was just a moment of naivete and idealism and ambition. And, if those three things hadn't combined, I'd probably still be flying around the world with a red passport.
I think having diplomatic immunity is cool, but being a memer is probably even more cool, certainly in this day and age.
Well, yeah, and I, not only being a memer, I was actually a guest on a Colombian podcast a week ago, and they called me in Spanish El Lord de los Memes. So apparently I'm a meme lord now, that's a great promotion. I'll take it.
Love it. I mean, I think International Intrigue hits such the right spot for where the world is right now. Geoeconomics, economic security, national security, all of that stuff is very serious. We live it day in, day out. Companies live and die by it. So do nations. And the general coverage is always that same style. It's very serious. You've got publications like Foreign Affairs. There are multi-thousand word articles with dozens of footnotes, and some people finish it, but a lot of people don't. You guys write a few hundred words on the same topic. You might have a funny quip or a joke in there, and 100,000 people read it that morning. So when it comes to geopolitics and how you all cover foreign affairs and trade and national security issues, why is it easy for you guys to make it funny, but the New York Times isn't very funny?
Well, there's so many ways to answer that. Thank you for those kind words. I mean, look, part of what we're doing is writing for 160,000 people we're now hitting every day. And we're writing for them the same way we used to write for the prime minister and the foreign minister, which is we're irreverent. Like, you're behind this sort of encrypted wall where you can just say what you think and you don't need to worry. And that's what the prime minister and the foreign minister, that's what they want. That's what they're paying us to do, to tell us tell them what we really think. So part of it is that. But I think also part of it is, one of the things that you learn to do as a diplomat is you're dealing with very busy people. In that case, for example, the prime minister, who doesn't have time to read all the cables and the foreign affairs articles, which are all great, by the way. But they need someone that they can trust who will say, Prime Minister, this is a 1 page on what happened while you were asleep. Here's what you need to know. And so, that's literally one of the jobs that I did when I was in the Foreign Service, is sort of get into the headquarters early in Canberra and kind of read through everything, and was on this roster that would prepare this sort of daily 1-pager. And that was part of the idea behind International Intrigue. Like, there's got to be more than just senior executives in Canberra that would value this kind of service. And so we founded International Intrigue on a hunch that there'd be busy people all around the world that would want that. And often, surprisingly, the difference between, the top secret, encrypted, black suitcase, secret squirrel stuff, often the difference is really just a few hours or a day rather than necessarily whether the conclusions and the insights we're putting in there are directionally correct or not. So yeah, that's kind of the genesis behind it. And just have fun. Partly, we feel like we're in a moment where too many of our friends and citizens of the free world, young people, busy people, it's too many of them are tuning out right when we feel like history really needs them to tune back in. And a lot of it, I don't think it's their fault. I think part of it is more that we as a media landscape, we as thinkers, as policymakers, we need to meet people where they are. And so there's always going to be nothing but value and respect for, some of those big legacy publications that you mentioned. But I guess we figured there was an opportunity to reach all those people that are smart and want to know about this stuff, but no one was doing it in a way that met them where they needed to be.
I mean, I've read and written thousands of cables over the course of my career, as I'm sure you have, and many of your colleagues still do at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at the U.S. State Department. And one of the things that struck me when I was in government was the sheer amount of information coming in. And I'm sure it's like this in the Australian government, where you have embassies all over the world. You've got dozens, if not more, diplomats at each of those embassies. Each one of those people are out doing things. They're meeting people. They're having conversations that get turned into reporting. And all of that reporting is funneled through the embassy as a first layer, and then it goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then, as you mentioned, someone in the Prime Minister's office or the United States, the President's daily brief, those things are correlated. Intelligence reporting is added to it. And there's a filtration layer to get rid of some of the noise and only focus on what matters. So in the policymaking community, that's very well understood. Embassies have been around for a long time. Diplomats have been around for a long time doing this kind of thing. But it's very different when it comes to the average audience member, perhaps for your organization, and certainly for business executives. What's your biggest takeaway from writing for prime ministers versus writing for CEOs and the other members of your audience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In terms of the difference between reaching a senior government official versus someone in business. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the main thing is that we're very mindful of the fact that there are two different games being played out simultaneously. One game is the one that I grew up in, is the geopolitics game, where there are a couple of hundred world leaders right now hustling for influence, trying to shape their region, shape world affairs in their own favor. Our audience includes a lot of people who play that game, diplomats and spooks and government officials who play that game. But I think the reality is, I say we government types have come to learn in some ways the hard way that the strength of our geopolitics game is only ever going to be as strong as the strength of our friends' game in the business world. So pioneering new tech, new business models, generating prosperity, security, getting our economies the inputs and the supplies they need. So I think that's a lesson that maybe other models, more authoritarian models like we've seen out of China, that's a lesson that they've just taken as obvious for decades. And you can see that in the way they sort of fused the civil and the military sides of their economy. And we see that in the headlines every day. But I think we in the free world have sort of had to learn that the hard way. I think COVID was almost, certainly for Australia's point of view, is an example of where all of a sudden the people in Canberra and the people in Sydney had to start talking to each other. We needed that sort of frontline intel from people, at the ports and with businesses all around the world. And likewise, they need to hear from us and talk more frequently with the embassies. So I think one of the lessons to answer your question is that really maybe the two audiences are not that different after all. They both kind of need to know what's coming around the corner, and they don't have a lot of time. And yeah, trust is the key currency, whether it's business executives or government executives.
I think to expand on that, you really hit the nail on the head with ever since COVID, something has changed where companies for decades treated geopolitics like weather, where you could kind of guess what was going to happen. You didn't really know how it was going to impact you. But that's different now, where you have organizations like yours that are, really pushing geopolitics to literally the forefront of people's inbox first thing in the morning in a way that historically has only occurred inside of government agencies, whether it's an intelligence agency or a foreign affairs shop, whatever the case may be. That's very different. And how do you see, or how does your audience view that change now that geopolitics is kind of baked into that business environment?
Yeah, I think traditionally markets have been really bad at and really ineffective at pricing in geopolitics, and so your weather analogy is spot on. There's like, well, not a lot we can do about it, so we just keep maximizing revenue and cutting costs or whatever, right? But the reality is that is changing wildly. And again, around the COVID era, I think Australia learnt that the hard way. We had lobster fishermen off the coast of Tasmania. We had beef farmers and barley farmers and coal miners who, or winemakers, all different sectors, professors in universities. You could pick almost any sector in our economy, and they were starting to wake up one day after another and realize that some government decision, in our case in Beijing, had suddenly wiped out their livelihoods. We had that sort of rude shock where we had a little bit of a disagreement with China about how to investigate the origins of COVID. And as a result, China took various retaliatory measures against our key export industries. And so, I mean, that straight away was a wake-up call that this was no longer just weather that you just ignore and plan around. This was existential, binary, like a tap that was being turned on and off. And so all of a sudden, I was sort of part of the government effort, reaching out to these export industries, but also being on the receiving end of panicked phone calls, wondering why all of a sudden, the thing that puts their kids through school was all of a sudden being held up in a port. So I think again, we in Australia learnt that the hard way. I think other countries learnt it the hard way a little earlier. Japan got a little bit of a shock when rare earths were sort of weaponized against them, about a decade ago. But the whole world is waking up to that and recalculating, and all of a sudden doing a stock take of literally every overseas relationship that we have taken for granted. And all of a sudden we're having to rethink, where's our vulnerability here? Where's our leverage? It's a wake-up call.
And Australia kind of sits at the pinnacle of that in a lot of ways. And I think you've served in South America and elsewhere. But from where you sit, what's the role for Australia in between the U.S. and China on some of these critical issues? Obviously, a member of the Five Eyes, long-standing historic military diplomatic cooperation. But there's still a huge reliance for Australian companies doing business with China. How do you square that?
Yeah, it's not a new challenge. I mean, pretty much ever since I've joined, ever since I joined as an Australian diplomat, ministers and prime ministers were openly talking about that, I think with different audiences in mind, our voters at home, but also our partners abroad. The reality has always been, for a while now, that China is our biggest export destination, particularly but not limited to raw materials. Just billions and billions of particular iron ore, but pretty much everything else as well we sell. Whereas the United States has long been our closest security partner and also our top investor. It's often forgotten. So it's not a new balance for us, but I think what is new is the way that it has sharpened. It used to be this kind of polite thing that we would say, but it's now something we feel. I think we're seeing that it's forcing us into tougher decisions that have painful trade-offs. And I think, we're not alone in that. For example, there was a particular rare earth shipment that we were selling to the United States that has a military purpose. and it was getting held up in a China-controlled port because they were mindful of what it was being used for. And so all of a sudden we have leverage. We kind of have each other by the ankle, all of us, and we're just constantly scanning for what leverage we have and what leverage adversaries and rivals might have. And it's just a constant daily recalibration across every sector. But yeah, it's not a new challenge, but it's definitely feeling sharper.
It's like the Spider-Man meme where everyone's pointing at each other, just waiting for the shoe to drop.
Yeah. I mean, you could pick a 1,000 memes to describe Australia-China relations, but and that's definitely one of them. Yeah.
What do you think executives can learn from some of that? There's critical sectors like rare earths that in the economic security zone people talk about all the time, given that it's in the news so much. But do executives for other industries get this type of risk as well now? We see this increasingly in the United States and in Europe with non-security, non-dual use commodities. Milk, for example, and milk exports, when the Netherlands enacted export controls on Chinese companies in the telecoms and the semiconductor space, Beijing retaliated with bans on Dutch milk. Australia obviously is a huge agricultural producer as well. Are other companies outside of these strategic sectors starting to see some of this?
Yeah, it's the examples are just piling up, and it's no longer a sort of necessarily a uniquely China thing. I mean, we've seen, for example, there was a moment there where Malaysia banned chicken exports to Singapore. There's not a security, a geopolitical thing. It was just a panicking domestic government trying to stabilize prices for a household staple. We've seen those. We've seen India slap export bans on rice for similar reasons. So you could pick almost any good in any trading relationship, and you will see that recalibration of governments suddenly losing faith and trust in the things that I probably grew up just taking for granted, which is that if you need to buy something, you can just buy it. Those days are not gone, but they are fading. They're under pressure. The reality is, though, I think this is one of those things that CEOs and business executives, they have heard people like me say before, but until it bites them, it still feels like someone else's problem. And so, for example, there were specific winemakers, for example, that got hit by specific trade retaliations by China. And I had these conversations with the wine industry, and we would say, well, you got to diversify. And like, there is no physical way you can diversify. There is no other China out there. There is not some other magical 1.2 billion people that love Australian wine out there. We either sell this to China or we go broke. And so there's a certain degree of, even if you want to preach the messages of diversification, and de-risking, there are some businesses out there where it sounds good, but it's just not realistic. There are others where, yes, it's possible you could diversify and say, well, I'm going to only sell a quarter of my stuff to China and 3/4 of my stuff elsewhere. But the reality is they're leaving profits on the table when they do that, because for whatever reason, it might be a consumer preference or something like that. But for whatever reason, there is a premium that many sectors earn when selling to China. And you can't tell a business to just leave that on the table. Sometimes they have to learn the hard way that it's going to be a sudden shock when that changes, if that changes. And he's hoping it doesn't, but we've seen that it can.
China is always going to be front page news. Iran, Russia, Ukraine, these are front page stories, but you cover the globe. You all cover everything related to economic security and geopolitics. What country should CEOs be paying attention to right now besides those?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I see, I can see a mix of opportunity and caution out there beyond China. Opportunity, I'm excited about Southeast Asia. These vibrant, huge and growing middle classes. Anywhere in the ASEAN region, I think, is somewhere that's worth putting on people's radars, particularly Indonesia, huge, vibrant economy, which just is constantly surprising me at how little we talk about it in the free world. I guess it's a mixture of opportunity and risk right now because they have this populist president called Prabowo, who is in the process of pushing through some historic state interventions into his economy, including, for example, slapping several key Indonesian commodity exports behind a new state-owned company. And this is a really generational change. These are, perhaps your listeners might be sourcing raw inputs, nickel or something from Indonesia, and all of a sudden it's no longer going to be a particular private company, but one state-owned enterprise running it all. So that's an example of massive disruption to the supply chain that is going to take some time to process, and we're still getting the details out of Jakarta now. But again, the opportunity, it is a huge, vibrant, tech-savvy, remarkable economy. I think China's tech companies have been on the front foot. TikTok has its marketplace thriving there. I think it's TikTok's largest or second largest market. That's an example of one where I see huge opportunity, but also right now disruption that is one way or another going to change the way we do business there.
It's a theme that we see elsewhere too, where capitals not only in Southeast Asia, but in Europe and the United States are now taking control over strategic commodities in a way that historically has not been the norm. I don't think we're going to stop seeing that happen anytime soon. I assume that it's only going to continue.
Yeah, and it's not only going to continue, it's going to keep creeping into new surprising dimensions of our lives and our economy. So one recent example that caught our eye in the last few days was that Chinese authorities have slapped travel curbs on private sector AI pioneers. So you could be a startup founder in China, or you could be a venture capitalist in China, or a researcher or a private scientist. Anyone who's kind of in that frontier AI field in the private sphere now needs government permission to travel abroad. And there are some details around that. That's the basic gist. I mean, that is a wild bit of news to wake up to if you're a startup founder in China. And I mean, it hints at a lot of things.
Or in Singapore.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that was that remarkable story of those guys that did everything. They relocated their startup to Singapore, cut all ties with the motherland, and still got slapped with a travel ban and had their exit banned. So yeah, I mean, we are seeing that's just one, in my mind, one fascinating kind of wild example of how we're not just slapping down restrictions on nickel or lithium, but people and brain power and ideas. And yeah, that hints at the intensity of the tech competition between China and the US and China and the broader West. But also it hints at, maybe the closeness of that race. I think we're used to the IP leakage going the other way. But this is an example of where, China, I mean, brilliant researchers and scientists and savvy entrepreneurs, really admirable strengths. And you can see that in that sort of paranoid government response of trying to lock people down and lock ideas down and get a feel for what it's like being on the receiving end of the rest of the world being interested in what your people can do.
Well, you guys are doing great work spreading not that type of information, but the information that the free world needs to see on a daily basis, and making it much more digestible and, quite frankly, enjoyable for a wider swath of the population. So really appreciate your time. I want to ask, though, one question. What is your favorite book? I always ask this, but in your case, if you've got a favorite memer or another funny account that we should follow, what do you suggest?
I mean, it's no secret I love memes. It started out as a form of very public therapy for, processing my 14 years of diplomacy life, and has now become a very powerful marketing tool for us. So I do love memes, but I do read a lot as well. Maybe I'll answer that. I love Elizabeth Weber's book on how China avoided shock therapy. Just a wonderful, detailed, very polarizing and controversial in some ways, but I just loved her take on China's journey to a sort of semi-liberalized economy. I also love Dan Wang's book, Breakneck, just so nuanced and thoughtful and insightful in the changes going on in China. I also love Evan Osnos' his book, Age of Ambition. Just again, a human, thoughtful, insightful look behind the Great Wall into this very interesting country. But at the same time, I try and balance out the heavy nonfiction stuff with spy novels. And so I'll recommend two writers for your readers. There's one ex-French DGSE guy, sort of France's CIA. He writes under the pseudonym Jack Beaumont, and he made the very wise decision to marry an Australian. So he now lives in Sydney, Australia, and he's written 3 brilliant books called the series is called The Frenchman. Very dark and gritty, real espionage stories. The other is an ex-CIA guy called David McCloskey, who's written 5 books now. The opening one is Damascus Station. Again, gritty, real, thoughtful, insightful. Love it. So there you go. I answered your question for 1 book with 5.
We'll be busy reading from now on. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find more about you and International Intrigue?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, if folks want to Google International Intrigue, will be the first result. And we're a very popular daily geopolitics briefing that's free. And I'm on all the socials, so look me up, and I'd love folks to follow along.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time. We'll be back in touch soon, I'm sure. We opened by calling Jeremy the diplomat who made memes serious business. But the serious business isn't really the memes. It's the thing underneath them. The free world is waking up, one industry and one country at a time, to a hard lesson. Business and government must work together to be geopolitically competitive in this new era. And the frontier keeps moving. Jeremy pointed at 2 places where executives aren't watching yet. Indonesia, a huge, vibrant economy pushing historic state interventions, folding key commodity exports behind a single state-owned enterprise. Think about that. Nearly 60% of global nickel supply comes from Indonesia. What happens if Jakarta decides to side with Beijing over Washington in a conflict? Separately, but staying in the region, Beijing is now slapping travel curbs on its own AI founders, researchers, and venture capitalists. Export controls not on nickel or lithium, but on people and ideas. One startup even relocated to Singapore, cut ties with the mainland, and still got hit. When a government starts locking down brain power, that tells you exactly how close and how intense the tech race has become. We appreciate Jeremy for joining the conversation to help us understand these issues. If the FT and the Wall Street Journal are already in your morning rotation, make room for International Intrigue. It's free, takes 5 minutes to read, and every bit is sharp. I'm Kit Conklin. We will see you next time on the Extra Exchange.